Again, what we're doing in these classes is we're kind of trying to give a picture of the years 1820 more or less to 1850. And we're paying special attention to France. Really, because it's a time, I think it's a time that's very much like our own, especially when you look at church-state relations, when you look at various political alliances and how they were formed. You can start to see, I think you start to see also during this time a number of patterns that start to take place that get repeated over and over again for the next 150 years. So it's a great time to study. And so just to be clear, in France, during this time, you have a number of factions that are competing. And if you go back to one of these first images I gave of the constitution of a society. If you really want to tell the constitution of a society, you need to look at the souls of the leaders of that part of society, whether it's theater or music, yes, the political institutions as well, the educational system, the military. Looking at the souls of these people, how they've formed themselves, you're going to understand how they're forming the society around them. Yes, and also the religious leaders, they also count. Yes.
Well, I'm just kind of wondering, because before the Jesuits got kicked out, they were the rulers. I mean, they owned education.
They were the primary educating. Yeah.
But then, how could the people who came out of those education be so bad?
A lot of times, the Jesuits themselves were not unified in how they taught. A lot of times, they emphasized teaching classical literature and contemporary naturalist philosophy without Thomism in many of the schools, not all. So that's why you could end up with like a Voltaire, like the Jesuits produced Voltaire, who knew the classics, and John Locke. So now in 1824, Charles X comes to power in France. He's the last legitimate monarch of France. The Bourbon, Charles X, you'll see. You will see. Especially you. So then, Charles X he's a monarch, and he really believes in the good of the monarchy. He wants to. He's actually somewhat friendly with the Jesuits. He also wants to see. Some people think this is just for political reasons, but he wants to see a kind of restoration of all the religious orders. It's during this time he starts to actually promote. In the early, I think in 1815 or 1816, the French reopened their seminary for the missions. It's right there. It's on the Rue des Bacs in France, in Paris. It's right next to where Our Lady appeared to St. Catherine Labouré in 1830. And, forged the miraculous medal and all that kind of stuff. So Charles X starts to really try to encourage these kinds of activities. At this time, though, there are many opponents. There are many opponents of Charles X. You have the Royalists. The Royalists who, by and large, they want to go back to some sort of regalism, pre-French Revolutionary regalism, where really the moderate Enlightenment kind of dominates the administrative structures, and the king just keeps a cap on the church, like Louis XV did, or like Joseph II did in Austria. You have remnants of the Jansenists that want to restore the glory of the courts, of the French courts. You have some politicians who are Gallican. The Gallican politicians or bishops tended to favor there just being a French church instead of having too much direction coming from Rome. We're still in a time where not a lot of direction is coming from Rome. Right? It's not the papacy of John Paul II. Okay? Rome, the prestige of the papacy in this time is increasing, but there's not really a lot of customs that are in place or set practices in place. In fact, it's really interesting during this time. A lot of time in many countries, as I was saying, the majority of bishops are basically slaves of the political regime. right? And a lot of the laymen that are discovering the importance of dogma and doctrine, and that are kind of giving an impetus to the beginning of the Thomistic revival, and who are trying to really push for the Gospels to kind of de-emphasize the naturalist and try to push an understanding of political life that's seen through the lens of the Gospels of Aquinas. A lot of times these people are precisely being tarred and feathered, figuratively speaking, by their bishops, right? who are basically flatterers of the regime, and they're being tarred and feathered figuratively by a lot of other Catholics out there, who again are just they've gone over to naturalism in one of its forms. These guys are the ones that really appeal to, we need the Pope, right? We need the Pope so that he can appoint bishops who want to implement the Gospels, who actually at this time also in France, in every diocese, there were like 7 or 8 different rites liturgically. So a lot of these reformers, these Catholic reformers, are arguing for things like, well, maybe there should be like one rite, right? And they're appealing to the Pope to do these kinds of things. And a lot of times in their first appeals to the Pope doesn't want to do it, right? Because why? Because he has all these bishops. He doesn't want to rock the boat. He doesn't want to turn the bishops against him. So the popes are sometimes reticent in the beginning to go along with the changes to give the Pope more power. In the beginning, I mean, in this time. You also have Bonapartists, right? There's a strong faction of people in France by this point. They want to see a new Napoleon. They're waiting for a new Napoleon. One of his children, one of his nephews or nieces. They're waiting for someone to rise up who's a strong military general who can basically bring back order, and he can bring back the sacred rule of the empire. Right? The sacred rule of the imperium. Yes.
Does the Pope still have the Papal States at this time?
Yes. Actually, up until 1870. Many of the Papal States were restored after the Congress of Vienna. They were restored to the Pope. And one little item about 19th century Italian history. Every time that there were several times where they had democratic referendums in the Papal States to choose to follow the Pope or to go along with the New Italy under Garibaldi and the Radical Enlightenment. And every time they had a vote, they voted overwhelmingly democratically to stay with the Pope. Which is why in the end Garibaldi said, well, we just have to force them to be free. We got to take it over. Yes?
In the beginning you said that Charles X was the last ruler who was...
He was the last legitimate king of France. We'll get to that. But by 1830, there's something I'll explain.
Okay.
Don't worry.
All right.
So then you also have a new party emerging. By the way, there's no Catholic action yet. There's no Catholic parties at this point. So all you have now is kind of a faction emerging. This faction would be like a minority of bishops, like 10% of the bishops. But there would be an educated Catholics who start coming out of these study circles, who basically, they want some sort of reform. They want some sort of reform that reflects, good, sound philosophical thinking and sound theological thinking. And you also see a new faction you start to see new factions emerging of extreme radicals. Radicals that go even further than the Jacobins of the French Revolution. And who basically, all these factions, as history goes on, their thought, you could say, matures. It starts to take on new contours. And a lot of what we're going to do is try to go through some of those new contours. Literary circles start to become hugely important. Especially, out of these study circles, you'll see some authors develop, like Victor Hugo. But actually, there are some now Catholics that develop who are like genuinely Catholic. For example, who's the greatest selling author of French literature in the 19th century?
Dumas.
Hmm?
Dumas.
No.
Is it the Thomist.
Man.
Yeah, that's
No.
later.
He's mentioned with horror in The Music Man.
Oh,
Yeah.
Bojack or
You got it. Yes. 15 points. Balzac. 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 Right? So Balzac, and actually Balzac was like, he was like, if you ever go to Paris, it's actually his house. It's not far from, it's on the other side of the river, but it's actually not far from the Eiffel Tower. And they take you to the room where he worked. And he really, he would put on, he really saw himself as, again, he didn't know the spirit of Opus Dei, okay? But, he had this real sense, I should work 10, 15 hours a day writing. And writing is a sacred, I should, when I write, I'm doing something that's sacred. So he would put on, a special cloak for writing. but to give it importance. And then you go into his room where he wrote, it was very Spartan. And on his desk was like this, with the crucifix here. And then on the other side of his room, he had an image of Our Lady. And on the shelf, on another side of the shelf, on the other side of his room, he had a cross, or a skull.
Skull.
Just like our father did in our father in his early days. He got rid of it eventually. But there was this tradition, or this custom, of always reminding yourself of death. Basically, to see that life is a preparation for death, and you got to be serious about what you're doing if you're going to offer it up to Christ. And one of the things that Balzac wrote, he wrote the human comedy. Right? He said because Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, so Balzac said, I want to create a picture of human life. And he wrote 33 novels dedicated to trying to create a real picture of human life. But also with ultimately the idea being that human life leads us to God. And he was actually the most popular novelist. He told his mother, when he was a 7 or 8 year old, he went to his mother and he said, Mom, when I grow up, I want to be the most popular novelist in France. And he did it.
How does his writing hold up? Still pretty good?
Well, there's never been... his books in French, I think they're awesome, but I can read French.
Yeah.
Right? But he never had good translators into English. And I think in part because when the people that started translating French literature into English were Enlightenment.
Yeah.
They were libtards of the Enlightenment. Right? So they gave great emphasis to Victor Hugo over Balzac. And so all the great translators would translate more Hugo into, because Hugo was a liberal Enlightenment figure, right? So they gave more importance to Hugo than they did to Balzac when they translated him into English. Yeah.
So he came out of one of these Catholic study circles.
Yeah. Actually, both Hugo and Balzac came out of these study circles. But Hugo didn't really grasp all the... he eventually fell into kind of an Enlightenment naturalism. When he wrote Les Miserables. We'll get there. But these literary circles, I think, are very formative for French culture in the 19th century. Because why? Well, literary circles they're a formative part of the constitution of a society. And then you start to get the rise of the French professoriate, the professor class. And the French professors in the university system are decidedly moderate and radical Enlightenment figures. From the French Revolution until this very day, it's very difficult for someone that's known to be Catholic to get into the French Academy. And the French are very good about watching even high school students. And if they're known publicly as Catholics, they cannot get into, for example, the ENA.
What's that?
The École Nationale d'Administration, which is like the Harvard of France. Right? They watch very closely. Right? Because why? They want to preserve the secularist character of the French state. And someone who's known publicly as a Catholic in his high school years cannot be trusted. Now, the Ivy League schools, which produced the elite of this country, did not allow Catholics in them until the 1950s. I'm not saying we're, so when I point to these examples of the French, I'm not saying we're any better. Right? So don't think that my criticism of the French means that I'm supporting something over here, right? Right? No, just, don't, just, because sometimes you can fall into that anyway.
Yeah.
So, little by little, actually, I think that is changing in France. There's been a few numeraries, actually, who have been appointed judges in France. And there's been a few numeraries that have made it into the professoriate. Cyril Michon and some other Catholics have become good, practicing Catholics, and they've made their, like Pierre Manon is a political philosopher who's kind of made it in France. Pierre Manon's books are excellent if you're looking for something to read in political philosophy. And also Remy Brague is a great fellow. Brague has written some interesting things on Islam, comparing Islam, Judaism, and Christianity on the natural law. He has a great book called I think it's called The Rule of Law. So, by the way, just as a little like image of this, Cyril Michon, who's a French numerary philosopher, and he in the year 2000 organized, there was all these like year 2000 conferences. And he organized one in the Sorbonne. And there's a lecture hall in the Sorbonne, which it was built probably in the 1500s or 1600s. And it was like the principal lecture hall of the Sorbonne. And close to that lecture hall is where Aquinas would have given his lectures in the Middle Ages. Right? And beginning in the French Revolution, the French professoriate began a custom that no Catholic would speak in this lecture hall.
What?
So from 1789, and then in the year 2000, Cyril Michon was at that time a lecturer in the Sorbonne. And the other interesting thing, Cyril's chair in the Sorbonne was the position of Etienne Gilson in the 1920s. And after that experience of Etienne Gilson was a perfect gentleman. He actually when he came to Harvard in the 1930s, he was such a gentleman. They thought we could. They said to themselves in their little notes back and forth, we think we could actually tolerate this Catholic at Harvard. So they actually offered him a tenure-track job at Harvard in the 1930s. Which he turned down to start the Medieval Institute in Toronto. But, Gilson was like a perfect gentleman.
Is that where Father Steve went?
Yeah. Gilson was like a perfect gentleman. But after this experience in the 1920s of him being just a few years at the Sorbonne, they basically said, we have to let like many years pass before we have another Catholic in this position. Because we don't want people to think that the Catholics are like polite. So then the next Catholic to hold the position of Etienne Gilson at the Sorbonne was Cyril Michon in the 1990s.
Is he rude?
No, Cyril Michon is he's an aristocrat. He's a count.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Most of the numeraries in France are aristocrats.
So another gentleman.
This is perfect, Jim.
This guy
Right?
Go on, let's see a monocle with a...
So anyway, Cyril Michon put this conference together in the year 2000, like to reflect on, the year 2000, the past century, the next century. And he was able to finagle getting Joseph Ratzinger to give the keynote address of the conference in the Salle de la Révolution.
No!
Yes. And he was the first Catholic to give a lecture in that hall since 1789.
And it was Joseph Ratzinger.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
And this was like a shot. This made the papers, and people commented. The French papers, the Masonic, liberal, whatever French papers, they all commented on this fact that it was like the first lecture by a Catholic in this lecture hall going back to 1789. So
now we have to wait another 100 years.
yeah, that's right. So also, you can't underestimate also the power of music. So in France during these years, the biggest thing were these singing. Basically, they were like bars where people would go to sing.
To karaoke?
No, but they wouldn't. It wasn't karaoke. They would sing together, right? And basically, again, the liberal elites would control who could be songwriters to write the songs for these singing clubs. There were 3,000 singing clubs in France. So basically at least one in every major city, in every city. And the tradition was, you go to the singing club, you have some vino, and you sing. There's a great movie by John Ford, How Green Is My Valley. I mean, just from this standpoint, is it like it's about coal miners in Wales, and it's actually it's kind of like a good social commentary type movie. But part of the movie is these coal miners are always singing. Like they go home at night from the coal mine and they're singing. They go, there's all sorts of scenes where they're singing their song. I think this was part not just of French culture, but a lot of European culture before the radio, right? Before they sang, but the elites were careful to basically squeeze the money supply. How do you control artists and professors? You squeeze the money supply so that not a lot of people go into it. And then you can, he who pays the piper calls the tune, right? You squeeze the money supply so that they're desperate, and that those who basically get in and stay in, they basically do what the money guys want them to. They write the lyrics the money guys want them to write.
That music was what they didn't expect was
The Spanish Inquisition.
No one expects
So anyway, these singing clubs were really important. Also, the theater was important. And again, the theater was generally controlled by liberal to radical Enlightenment figures. And what they would do a lot of times is they would take plays, the older plays of Molière, but they would always cast the Jesuits as the bad guy. Right? Whoever's the bad, hypocritical figure, they would put him in Jesuit garb. And they do that. The French department in Notre Dame does that to this day. They always put the Jesuit or the Holy Cross priest in the garb of they always do Molière plays. And then they always put the Jesuit or the Holy Cross priest in the garb of the hypocrite of the film or the theater production. So Charles X actually was fairly popular. The people kind of loved him. And then for both the moderate Enlightenment people who were kind of getting rich after the French Revolution, and also by the way, both the radical and the moderate Enlightenment people were fairly wealthy. I mean, we're not talking about very few people were poor or starving artist types. Okay? So they were deeply concerned about the popularity of the policies of Charles X. But so they knew they couldn't directly criticize him. Right? At one point, his popularity grows because a Bonapartist assassinates one of his children. Right? And that just, of course, assassination attempt always leads the popularity to grow. They tried in the press initially to pin it not on a Bonapartist, but to pin it on the Jesuits. Right? That there was some sort of conspiracy in the Jesuits to assassinate Charles X.
Who have been reinstated?
Yeah, in 1824, Charles X is instated as king after Louis XVIII.
But the Jesuits are now allowed back?
Yeah, the Jesuits came back to the country in 1816. They were reinstated by the Pope in 1814.
When were they dissolved?
They were dissolved in around 1770.
Okay. So, sorry, so 40 years they don't exist, then they exist immediately. There's a ton of vocations, or how is that?
So there were some, by 1816, there were some Jesuits, like Abbe Barruel. He was a Jesuit when they were suppressed. And he returned as a Jesuit and lived for several years as a Jesuit before he died. And so there were a handful. And then there were also Jesuits that were able to keep the order alive in Russia and in Prussia.
Gotcha.
during the time it was suppressed, because it never got suppressed in those countries. So there were some that were able to come back.
It's pretty impressive, though. That,
Yeah.
40 years later.
Yeah.
Um,
These dates might not be fully accurate, but it's more or less this.
More or less.
Yeah. So then what happens is, so the liberals decide, well, both the moderate and the radicals kind of unite at this point. A lot of times they're against each other, right? But at this point they unite in 1826 or so, and they basically decide the only way we're going to be able to take down Charles X is we're going to have an extended public relations campaign against the Jesuits. And we're going to then associate Charles X with the Jesuits, and then maybe we can bring, because you can't have a lot of propaganda against Charles X because he's too popular. So basically, let's go back to the old tropes of the 18th century. So they basically, to hear us, I didn't write down all the examples, but from 1826 or so to 1828, there's a huge publishing bonanza to basically describe all sorts of conspiracies of the Jesuits. They revivify the 748, this book from before the French Revolution. I mean, this is true conspiracy theory in its bad sense, right? Of just making up all sorts of lies and plots that have no foundation in reality. So, for example, what they say, one of the things that they say is that that now in 1824 that there were 50,000 Jesuits in France, and like that there was some sort of Jesuit factory. And what they were doing is that they were going into schools and they were kidnapping little boys, right? And they would produce these novels, and the novel would always be Jesuits beating up, like just thirsting to beat up children in school, right? Like it was the hope and the dream of every Jesuit to become a grade school or a high school teacher so he could beat up boys, right? So they produced novels like this. They accused the Jesuits of having some sort of like mysterious factory where they kidnap boys. They bring them to the Jesuit headquarters. They hypnotize them, or they do something to basically haze them to get them to become Jesuits, and that there must be 50,000 Jesuits in the country. They basically there was a group of nobles who were like especially loyal to the king. They come up with this conspiracy that the Jesuits, basically all these nobles are secret Jesuits, right? This kind of stuff. The Jesuits started all these study circles that began during the late reign of Napoleon, and that began after the rule of Napoleon. The Jesuits created all of these study circles, and they brainwashed the people who were part of these study circles to create a new faction of Catholic reformers.
So those study circles were a big enough deal to be on the radar.
By the 1820s, they're kind of on the radar. Yeah.
Are they still going on? Are they-
Oh yeah. They're becoming quite popular. Yeah. And in fact, a lot of times it's the only way that Catholics can educate people, each other.
To this day, you're saying? Or you're saying active?
Well, I would say to this day, even, yeah. It still continues.
They still have
I remember Father Bill Stetson, after I whistled, he said to me, "You know what you should do at Marquette? You should get a bunch of your friends together and form like a little reading group, right? Because that's what Catholics have been doing since the time of the French Revolution, right? To try to, get the good ideas out there." That the Jesuits are interested in money laundering. They're basically, and then I forgot to write down all the lists of like 50 common like black legends that were started about the Jesuits at that time. They were assassins. I mean, all that kind of stuff. So finally, through different political maneuverings that are going on in the equivalent of like in what the time you would call, I guess now we would say it was like the Senate. The radical, also during this time, by this time Voltaire kind of has a bad name in France, so they accused the Jesuits of being promoters of Voltaire. They accused the Jesuits of founding the Masons. They accused the Jesuits of forming all the worst elements in the French Revolution that sent people off to the guillotines, right? The Jesuits get accused of everything that's potentially evil. So the Jesuits are going to bring Muslims into France, right? The Jesuits are going to basically they're going to ruin French culture. And they accused the Jesuits everything of trying to alienate all the different aspects of the population against the Jesuits, with the idea that at some point they'll be able to, by guilt by association, I mean, the plan is at some point guilt by association will come into effect, and they'll be able to say that Charles X is allied with the Jesuits, and therefore we can have a coup and throw him out. By 1828, in maneuverings that are going on in the Senate, the radicals are able to get a majority of people sympathetic with their position in the Senate. So from 1828 to 1830, they put the Jesuits on trial in the Senate. Well, it's not called the Senate. I think it's called the Chamber of Deputies or something like that. But it's basically a Senate. Okay? So the Jesuits in the Senate, they're put on trial. During the trial, the most evidence that they can come up with is that there might be 1,000 Jesuits in the country, not 50,000. But when this is proved, the radicals basically say, well, this proves there's a conspiracy. Right? They're able to hide 49,000 members. During this, remember last class I spoke about all these illegal high schools that were being started under the loophole in the law of high schools connected with seminaries? Well, during this trial, it's discovered that all these high schools, that there's kind of a racket going on, right, in these high schools. They're not sending all their students into the seminaries. And so all these high schools get shut down between 1828 and 1830. And all the seminaries are closed. At this point,
All the dioceses.
yeah, at this point, the bishops kind of wake up. Like, maybe we shouldn't be flatterers of the regime. Right? And also, the Jesuits, the bishops and the Jesuits and the Catholics are infuriated. Right? All the people stop, when they take the time to stop praying the rosary and have their devotions to the Sacred Heart, they're super infuriated at this point. And a lot of the Catholic leaders, intellectual leaders like Balzac, they're ready to go up in arms. And Catholics in the real Catholic parts of the country, like the West, they're actually getting ready to take up arms at this point, to open up the seminaries. So the bishops and the Jesuits, they write a petition to the Pope at the time, Leo XII, what to do. He responds, he says, do nothing, go quiet. Let them just kind of have their way. And so what happens is, in 1830, the radicals and the moderates, they basically institute a coup d'etat. They remove Charles X, the Bourbon, and they go. Who do they go to? They go to the family of the Orleans family, the family that was supportive of the French Revolution in its opening days. And they get one of the descendants of the Orleans family, which is a branch of the Bourbon family, Louis Philippe, and they basically say, we're going to make you king. You're not going to be king of France. You're going to be king of the French people, and you're basically going to go along with implementing capitalism and a robust foreign policy. So, and we're going to live in harmony with the British and with the British way of doing things. And Louis Philippe says, yeah, let's do it. I'll be the king, not of France, but of the French people. And he rules from 1830 until 1848. And during it's called the July Monarchy. Right? Because it's a coup d'etat basically in July of 1830.
Why are they called the Royalists?
It's just the last name. It's the family name of a branch of the Bourbon.
Okay.
I think they come from Orleans in France, from that part of France. So, and then he basically organizes like one figure under him is a guy who had a lot of influence on de Tocqueville. He organizes under him and lets a kind of coalition of moderate and radical naturalists, or moderate and radical Enlightenment figures, to govern France. Now, at this point, I would like to introduce you to one figure who's very important both for 19th century political philosophy and also 19th century Catholic thought. But before I do that, I'll take a question from the peanut gallery.
Yeah, I just didn't get some of the names. Okay, so basically, Catholics are angry. They shut down the seminaries, shut down the high schools. Send a letter to Pope. Pope says, don't do anything.
Just go along. Go with the flow.
Anything. Meanwhile, the liberals, naturalists, they stage this coup, and who takes over?
The July Monarchy.
July Monarchy.
They get rid of Charles X.
Okay.
He's gone now, right? And they basically install Louis Philippe.
So this is where the Orleans.
Yeah, and he's the Orleanist. And to show what a liberal he is, he only wears gentleman's suits. He doesn't wear the robe anymore of king.
And Guzzo.
And you call yourself an Orleanist?
I'm a legitimist.
You're a legitimist. Okay, good.
They have a.
We'll have to send an email to Dale Parker and ask what he is.
They have a clothing. I just looked up Louis Philippe. There's a clothing brand named after him.
Yeah. He's a dedicated follower of fashion.
And Guzzo just implemented these policies.
Guzzo, what ends up happening is underneath him during the 18 years of his rule, there's all this jockeying between the radicals and the liberals, the radicals and the moderates. Like who's gonna rule, and how fast are they going to push the revolutionary principles and cut out the church? And Guizot basically, I think by the end he ends up on top for a few years, and he's a big proponent of. Guizot is a big proponent of like free markets, robust foreign policy, like empire-type foreign policy, and then religion as like a morals police. Religion making sure people pay their taxes, a natural religion, a religion that makes sure that people pay their taxes, that they get their vaccines, they get their vaccinations, and that they serve in the army, that kind of stuff.
He's in neither camp, radical or moderates. He's kind of.
I think he's in one of the camps. I think he's in the more moderate camp, but he's still clearly a liberal. Any other questions?
Yeah.
So now this figure, Félicité de Lamennais. And he's an interesting figure. He's kind of a tragic figure because he ends up I think outside of the church. I don't remember now if he reconciled before he died. But yeah, I'm sure there's a Wikipedia page on him. But he's kind of and actually that's wrong, I think. I mean, it's right and wrong. It's not the full story. So Lamennais, who's Lamennais? Lamennais, he's born right before the French Revolution. His dad is really concerned about him getting martyred, actually, because his dad is a strong Catholic. But his dad has a large library, and his dad, in order to protect him, kind of as a teenage boy, kind of locks him in the library. And the dad also in his house would hide faithful priests in the 1790s who stayed in France to kind of give the sacraments out. So kind of what happens with Lamennais, he's homeschooled, but he's homeschooled like with no curriculum other than the books that were on the shelves. And the books on the shelves were just like they were like a random collection of Rousseau, maybe some good Catholic things. Maybe some documents from the Council of Trent, the Gospels, literature. So kind of wide reading, but maybe not so. Maybe no. There was no like systematic study of any one thing. So kind of like maybe like a variation of a Great Books program, right? Because there's no classes that he was receiving. So by 1815, he and his brother published a defense of Catholic things. And they criticize a number of Catholic ideas that they saw and Catholic errors that they saw in the 19th century. So, first of all, they say, Catholic errors from the 18th century, I'm sorry. And they say, look, in the 18th century, Catholics had a very poor understanding of freedom. Because true freedom is to live the life of Jesus Christ. And they equated freedom in the 18th century just as freedom from conversion or feeling some sort of interior freedom within your consciousness. Catholics of the 18th century, they were too detached from the Pope. As someone pointed out here in one of the lectures the other day, I think it was Joe Archer. Joe Archer asked the question, where were the Catholics? Where were the Catholics active in political life in all this? Well, maybe that was in the catechism class. But actually, so Lamennais says the same thing. In the 18th century, you don't see any real Catholics in public life, in France at least, who are willing to try to bring good philosophy and good theology to bear in the life of society. There's no cosmos of Aetolia in the Catholic world, right, in the 18th century. There's no attempt really to Christianize social institutions. There's no sense of mission. It seems like there was kind of an indifference or a kind of embarrassment about the Gospels and the requirements of the Gospels. And so what ends up happening is that you get a lot of people that just imitate. They just imitated either some brand of British empiricism or emerging Lockeanism or emerging radical thought or Rousseauianism, or they followed Kant. And religion the truths of religion took on a secondary place in people's consciousness. Religion began to be seen only as something useful, something natural. But people lost the sense of the meaning of revelation. And really what you end up having is either you have public figures who were Catholic, who basically picked and choose. They basically they were like the classical definition of a heretic. They were picking and choosing from Catholic doctrine to look Catholic, but then to do all sorts of things that were just completely Enlightenment and worldly. Whether it was as Lockean or a follower of Voltaire or Rousseau or Adam Smith or Immanuel Kant. And then Catholicism was basically limited to piety and devotions. They would pray their rosary, they would have their Sacred Heart devotions, but it had no effect in public life, no real effect in public life, political life, social life. So therefore, what do we need to do? And they use the word. They use the word for the first time. We need Catholic action.
No.
Yeah. We need the church to give an impetus to Catholic action in public life for the sake of restoring the kingship of Christ. Now, it's not part of the Pope's not promoting it yet. But they kind of start coming up with, they're trying to say, well, what are the proposals? What can we do? What can we do to encourage lay people? Actually, and they're thinking about this, right? How can we encourage lay people to actually bring the faith to bear in their lives? We need Catholic action. We need the Pope to be more of a teacher. We need the Pope to point out errors and then leave people free to act, but to at least point out the errors so that people don't fall off a cliff. Chesterton will develop this argument eventually in one of his books about how it's good to have some things where you say no, because then everything else is open. In a sense, like I know recently, right, I just had this little experience recently. In the sense, in the old days, when there's the index, when there was the index, I know it needs to be properly understood and everything, but when there was the index, if it's on the index, you can't read it. right? But then if something's written by like a good Catholic and it's not on the index, like you can read that guy and trust him. But when there's not the index, you can fall into all sorts of other criteria for whether to read a book or not. You know, whether it's mainstream or whether it's acceptable in polite company, right? Which have really nothing to do with the value of the book. Yes.
Sorry, what's the index?
The index was a list of books forbidden to read for Catholics. You had to, and if not forbidden, absolutely, you could appeal to somebody. You could appeal to your pastor, and every city had like a commission who could grant if like you could make a case for reading the book. It's funny. I had a professor. The index existed up until
19.
I don't know. I had a professor at Marquette who at the Louvain in the 1970s. At the Louvain in the 1970s, they still used the index. And this guy, when he was doing his PhD, he wanted to read some books that were on the index. So he asked the local whatever to get approval to read some books. And he was in his dorm room one day, and this guy comes to him like in medieval garb, with a hat and a feather coming out of it, and a cape and knickers or whatever. He opens up a scroll and he reads in Latin, permission to read whatever the books are. Yeah. That's at the Louvain in the 1970s.
Where's that?
Louvain's in Belgium. I'm going to explain that in a minute, what the Louvain is. Actually, not in a minute. In 5 minutes, I'll explain it.